Judicial emotion is a touchy subject. On one hand, you have judges such as Justice Sonia Sotomayor who believe it is imperative for the judge to not apply feelings to facts, and on the other hand, you have the confirmation hearing of now Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who demonstrated extreme levels of emotion in all varieties. And while the levels of emotion present in the Kavanaugh hearing are not necessarily commonplace in the courtroom, it still demonstrates that the widespread intuitions of a dispassionate judge are inherently flawed. On top of being incorrect, these intuitions have led to a significant gap in legal and psychological research, particularly in the realm of judicial anger. So considering the stigma surrounding an angry judge, this makes sense. Anger is typically associated with irrational decision-making, so it is understandable how people would not want to acknowledge its presence in the courtroom. And the research that does choose to examine judicial anger does so using a traditional social psychological theory of anger, which by itself is incomplete and lacking depth. So my research focuses on a newer model of anger called the recalibrational theory of anger. And this theory operates under the framework of evolutionary psychology, which examines psychological mechanisms such as anger from an evolutionary standpoint. So while most psychological theories just explain the function of any given mechanism, an evolutionary perspective involves explaining how and why the mechanism evolved. And this is the case with the recalibrational theory, which focuses on the computational basis of anger. More specifically, this theory frames anger in terms of welfare trade-off ratios, which are complex internal regulatory variables that track how much you or anyone else are willing to incur costs to benefit another person's welfare. So you're said to have a positive welfare trade-off ratio to an individual if you're willing to incur costs to benefit their welfare. For example, if you miss an episode of a TV show to care for a sick friend, you're said to have a positive welfare trade-off ratio toward that friend. And furthermore, welfare trade-off ratios can be broken down into two parts: an expected welfare trade-off ratio, which involves the treatment you expect from another person, and an observed welfare trade-off ratio, which involves the treatment you actually receive from another person. And this theory states that a person should become angry when these two welfare trade-off ratios are not equal. For example, if you expect a higher welfare trade-off ratio than what you actually see, the anger mechanism becomes activated. The purpose of anger, therefore, is to demonstrate that to the receiving individual that they do not sufficiently value your welfare. In an ideal situation, the person would apologize and the anger would subside, effectively recalibrating their welfare trade-off ratio to a higher level. And the formidability hypothesis helps relate the recalibrational theory of anger to judicial anger. It explains reasons why certain individuals may be more prone to anger than others. These individuals could have an increased ability to inflict costs, which in turn increases the welfare trade-off ratio they expect from others. This is because, from an evolutionary standpoint, those who are able to inflict costs could demand better treatment from others. It makes sense, then, why people who possess traits such as attractiveness, strength, and positions of power could be more prone to anger. So when comparing the recalibrational theory to existing theories of anger, it is important to mention that they are not necessarily incompatible. One is not a substitute for another. Both frame anger as an apology-seeking emotion, and both emphasize the role of control, such as the ability to inflict costs, in describing anger. However, they do differ in two key ways. One, an evolutionary analysis explains both proximate and ultimate causes, so why and how it evolved. And two, they arrive at different conclusions. So, using the recalibrational theory allows us to investigate questions that are left unanswered by traditional views of anger. For example, it is possible to re-examine courtroom protocol using welfare trade-off ratios. So there are strict formalities in the courtroom. Lawyers are required to use your honor when addressing the judge. The judge should tie up in the room on the bench. Lawyers must ask for permission to speak, and judges wear black robes. It is possible that these were developed in an effort to prevent judicial anger. Judges should be anger prone since they hold position of power, so it makes sense that there needs to be protocol to keep their anger in check. And the formidability hypothesis could also predict which characteristics could predispose a judge to anger. It could be possible to measure physical strength and attractiveness in a judge, and see whether they are more prone to anger than a judge lacking these characteristics. Lastly, acknowledging the recalibrational theory allows for the creation of better emotional regulation strategies for judges. Knowing the characteristics that predispose judges to anger allows for more effective strategies to be created. If, for instance, strength and attractiveness are found to be correlated with judicial anger, it would be beneficial to make judges aware of these predispositions and attempt to have them monitor their own outbursts of anger.